There are few battles that compare to the devastation of Verdun. For 302 days, the fields around Verdun became an endless nightmare of artillery, gas, and close-quarters combat. Hundreds of thousands fell in a place where every inch of ground was paid for in blood. And in this episode, we will be talking about those hundreds of thousands and their stories. Welcome to ASMR War History. Tonight, we dive into the longest battle of the First World War, the Battle of Verdun, a clash that would come to define both the horror and endurance of modern warfare. Before we begin, if you enjoy war history told in a calming, immersive way, please take a moment to like and subscribe. It helps the channel grow and ensures you never miss a story from the past. Now, let's begin with an overview of the Battle of Verdun, how it started, why it mattered, and the unimaginable toll it took on those who fought there. On the 21st of February 1916, the German Fifth Army launched an assault on the French Second Army along the rugged hills north of Verdun. This would become the longest battle of the First World War, stretching across 302 days of relentless combat. The Germans had chosen Verdun not just for its strategic importance, but for its symbolic value. Knowing that the French would fight to the last man to defend it, the German plan was designed to break the French army, not just by seizing ground, but by bleeding them dry. Their objective was the Meuse Heights, an elevated position perfect for artillery fire, where German guns could hammer Verdun while forcing the French to commit wave after wave of reinforcements into the grinder. The Germans believed they could force France to collapse under the weight of its own casualties. Poor weather delayed the assault, but when it began, it struck with devastating force. Within the first 3 days, the Germans overran Fort Douaumont, one of Verdun's key defensive strongholds. The French reeled under the impact, suffering massive losses as they scrambled to hold the line. But despite their early success, the German advance slowed. The defenders fought tenaciously, forcing their attackers into brutal, close-quarters combat amid the wreckage of shattered villages and trenches. By early March, the French had rushed more than 20 divisions into the defence of Verdun. Their new commander, Philippe Pétain, issued one simple order: they shall not pass. His strategy was clear. There would be no retreat. Every German attack would be met with an immediate counterattack, even if it meant exposing his own troops to devastating artillery fire. The battle transformed into a horrific stalemate, with both sides locked in a war of attrition. By the end of March, French artillery positioned on the west bank of the Meuse began a relentless bombardment of the German positions on the opposite side, inflicting heavy casualties. In response, the German High Command expanded the offensive, launching attacks on the west bank of the river in a desperate attempt to eliminate the French guns. But these efforts fell short. The terrain, combined with French resistance, turned every advance into a bloodbath. In May and June, the Germans shifted their tactics once more, launching smaller, concentrated assaults. Fort Vaux fell in early June, after a desperate last stand by its defenders, who held out for days despite being choked by gas and cut off from supplies. German forces then pushed forward, driving a wedge deep into French defences, seizing the village of Fleury devant Douaumont and pressing within 4 kilometres of the Verdun citadel. For a moment, it seemed Verdun might actually fall. But then the tide began to turn. By July, the focus of the war had shifted to the Battle of the Somme, forcing the Germans to pull men, guns and ammunition away from Verdun. In the coming months, the French took full advantage of the weakening German pressure, launching their own counter-offensives. Between June and August, the village of Fleury changed hands 16 times, a testament to the sheer brutality of the fighting. In September, the French finally began to push the Germans back, reclaiming ground lost in the opening months of the battle. In December, they recaptured Fort Douaumont and Fort Vaux, reversing nearly everything the Germans had fought so hard to take. After nearly a year of slaughter, the battle that was meant to break the French army had failed. Instead, it became a defining symbol of French resilience, a national ordeal that tested the limits of human endurance. By the end, the numbers were staggering. More than 700,000 casualties, with the French suffering 377,000 losses, and the Germans 337,000. On average, 70,000 men per month were killed, wounded, or missing. Some historians estimate that the total casualties in the region around Verdun, over the course of the entire war, may have exceeded 1 million. Verdun was more than just a battle. It was a war within a war, a place where nations poured their strength into an abyss of mud, fire, and steel. So with all of that said, let's rewind a bit back to September of 1914. After the German advance into France was halted at the First Battle of the Marne, in September of 1914, the War of Movement came to an end. Over the following months, the Battle of the Yser and the First Battle of Ypres solidified the deadlock. The Germans constructed a network of field fortifications to hold the ground they had taken, while the French shifted to siege warfare, determined to break through the German defences and reclaim lost territory. But by the end of 1915, it was clear that neither side had found a decisive breakthrough. French and British offensives had gained little ground, but had cost enormous numbers of lives. It was in this grim reality that Erich von Falkenhayn, the chief of the German General Staff, devised a brutal new strategy. According to his memoirs, Falkenhayn had abandoned the idea of achieving victory through a single decisive battle. Instead, he believed the French army could be bled dry if it were forced into a battle of attrition on German terms. His plan focused on Verdun, a heavily fortified sector where the French, he believed, could not afford to retreat. The idea was to draw the French into a prolonged, grinding battle, where their forces would be annihilated under sustained German artillery fire. Falkenhayn calculated that the French, desperate to hold the city, would throw their reserves into the meat grinder, suffering catastrophic losses, while German defences remained intact. Even if the battle did not lead to immediate victory, it would weaken France beyond recovery. Drawing lessons from the Second Battle of Champagne, Falkenhayn intended to rely on heavy artillery and carefully coordinated assaults rather than a broad offensive. He saw how French troops had been devastated by German artillery barrages in previous battles and believed this method could turn Verdun into a death trap. If France committed all of its reserves to Verdun, Britain would be forced to mount a relief offensive elsewhere, stretching Allied forces to their breaking point. By December of 1915, intelligence services in the Netherlands had intercepted hints of German plans and passed them to the British. But there was little certainty about the true scale of what was coming. For the Germans, success depended on overwhelming firepower. Falkenhayn had allocated 5 army corps to the offensive, but he refused to commit his full strategic reserves, believing they would be needed to counter any British response. The goal was clear: to force the French into a position where they had no choice but to fight and to bleed them to the point of collapse. If France suffered enough casualties, it might even be forced to seek peace. And if that happened, Germany could turn its full attention to Britain and force them off the continent entirely. The battlefield itself favoured the attackers. The fortified region of Verdun sat in a vulnerable salient, jutting into German-held territory. General Joseph Joffre, the French commander-in-chief, had previously underestimated the importance of fixed fortifications. After witnessing the swift German capture of Liège and Namur in 1914, He had come to believe that traditional forts were obsolete in the face of modern siege artillery. This led to a dangerous underestimation of Verdun's defences. By August of 1915, Joffre had ordered 54 artillery batteries and over 100,000 rounds of ammunition removed from Verdun. Even more alarmingly, Fort Douaumont and Fort Vaux, two of the strongest defences in the sector, were partially dismantled, their garrisons reduced to small maintenance crews. In 1914, the French had already lost a critical railway at Saint-Mihiel, severing a direct supply line to Verdun. Then, in July of 1915, another key rail link west of Verdun was cut by German forces. By the time the Germans finalised their plans for the attack, Verdun was isolated, poorly supplied, and dangerously vulnerable. For centuries, the town of Verdun, perched on the banks of the Meuse River, had been a fortress of strategic importance. It had withstood siege attempts dating back to Attila the Hun in the 5th century, and when the Empire of Charlemagne was divided under the Treaty of Verdun in the year 843, the town became part of the Holy Roman Empire. It was not until the Peace of Westphalia in 1648 that Verdun officially became French territory. At the heart of the city stood its citadel, a powerful stronghold reinforced in the 17th century by the military engineer Vauban, who transformed it into a near impenetrable defensive hub. By the late 19th century, France had taken Verdun's defences to an entirely new level. A double ring of 28 forts and smaller defensive works had been constructed around the town, all positioned on high ground at least 490 feet above the Meuse River Valley, and ranging 1.5 to 5 miles from the citadel. This vast defensive network had been devised in the 1870s by the military strategist Serre de Rivière, forming part of an extensive system designed to protect France from future invasions. One line stretched from Belfort to Epinal, while another ran from Verdun to Toul, each forming a barrier of steel and stone meant to slow and cripple any advancing army. Over the decades, these forts were modernised to withstand the ever-growing firepower of artillery. At Fort Douaumont, the largest and most imposing of Verdun's fortifications, extensive upgrades began in the 1880s. The walls were reinforced with thick steel and concrete, covered by additional layers of earth to absorb artillery shells. By the early 1900s, the fort was equipped with an advanced network of retractable gun turrets, including 75mm and 155mm artillery pieces that could emerge from the ground to fire and then retract into protective steel housings. The outer ring of Verdun's defences extended for 28 miles, and the forts were carefully positioned to overlook and support each other, creating interlocking fields of fire. These defensive positions contained 79 heavy guns in armoured turrets, along with more than 200 lighter guns and machine guns placed strategically to cover the trenches and ditches surrounding the forts. Many of these turrets were capable of rotating a full 360 degrees, allowing them to respond to attacks from multiple directions. By 1903, Fort Douaumont had undergone further enhancements, including the construction of a powerful concrete bunker known as the Casemate de Bourges. This structure housed two 75mm field guns positioned to cover the southwestern approaches to Verdun and reinforced the defensive lines stretching toward Ouvrage de Froidterre. The fort's northern and eastern walls bristled with twin Hotchkiss machine guns and additional 75mm turrets designed to halt any advancing enemy. The most imposing feature was an armoured turret containing a short-barreled 155mm gun, allowing the garrison to fire devastating high-explosive shells at enemy forces approaching from the north. But the Verdun fortress system was more than just a collection of isolated forts. Between them lay an intricate network of underground bunkers concrete artillery positions, machine gun nests, and observation posts, all connected by telephone lines, telegraph cables, and narrow-gauge railways. A system of roads allowed for the rapid movement of troops and supplies, ensuring that each fort could support its neighbours in times of crisis. At full strength, the fortified region of Verdun had a garrison of 66,000 men, with supplies stockpiled to last 6 months. In theory, it was one of the most impregnable defensive positions in France. But in the years leading up to 1916, many of Verdun's fortifications were quietly weakened, as French High Command underestimated their importance. By the beginning of 1916, Verdun was already surrounded on 3 sides by German forces. The French had been cut off from their primary railway supply route as early as mid-July 1915, when German divisions of the Fifth Army, under Crown Prince Wilhelm, advanced through the forest of Argonne. Only a single narrow-gauge railway remained for the French to bring in bulk supplies, while the Germans had access to mainline railways just 15 miles to the north. To prepare for the coming offensive, the Germans launched a massive logistical effort. Entire towns and villages were emptied of civilians, with buildings requisitioned for military use. Thousands of miles of telephone cables were laid, vast stockpiles of ammunition and rations were hidden under camouflage, and hundreds of artillery positions were dug into the hills. The Germans built 10 new rail lines with 20 stations to bring in supplies and troops, ensuring a steady flow of reinforcements. Meanwhile, underground bunkers, known as Stollen, were excavated, each buried between 15 and 46 feet deep, and capable of housing up to 1,200 soldiers. The Fifth Army's ranks swelled with reinforcements. 3 corps, the 3rd Corps, the 7th Reserve Corps, and the 18th Corps, were transferred to Verdun, each reinforced with 2,400 battle-hardened veterans and 2,000 trained recruits. Additional divisions were placed in reserve, ready to exploit breakthroughs and mop up any remaining resistance once the French defence collapsed. But the true power of the German offensive lay in its unprecedented artillery concentration. A staggering 1,201 guns were positioned around Verdun, 2/3 of which were heavy and super-heavy artillery. To sustain their firepower, the Germans prepared a massive logistical operation, delivering over 2 million shells in the first 6 days alone, followed by another 2 million over the next 12 days. 33.5 munitions trains per day would keep the guns supplied. Factories in Germany were placed on standby to rapidly refurbish artillery needing repairs, while 5 dedicated repair shops were built close to the front to keep the massive artillery force operational. With their guns in place, the Germans devised a meticulously coordinated battle plan. The Fifth Army divided the Verdun front into 4 attack sectors. The 7th Reserve Corps would strike first, followed by the 18th Corps, 3rd Corps, and the 15th Corps attacking across the Wavre plain. The preliminary artillery bombardment was scheduled to begin on the morning of February 12th, followed by an infantry assault at 5 in the evening. German soldiers would advance in open order, supported by grenade and flamethrower detachments. The objective was not just to seize territory, but to annihilate the French forces in the field, forcing them into relentless counterattacks against well-prepared German defences. However, an ambiguity crept into the German battle plan. Chief of Staff Erich von Falkenhayn envisioned Verdun as a meat grinder, a place where the French would bleed themselves dry in fruitless counter-offensives. But the Fifth Army had a different interpretation. They believed in a swift, decisive victory, capturing Verdun outright rather than simply wearing down the enemy. This confusion between a war of attrition and a war of conquest was never fully resolved, and was left for corps commanders on the battlefield to sort out. The artillery strategy was laid out in precise detail. long-range guns would bombard French supply routes and assembly areas, while specialist batteries would fire gas shells to disrupt enemy movements. French fortifications would be targeted by the heaviest howitzers, and the rolling artillery barrage would move forward as the infantry advanced. Observers positioned with the infantry would coordinate artillery fire using field telephones, flares, and coloured balloons. By the time the offensive began, the French would be under continuous bombardment, day and night, leaving them disoriented and unable to mount an effective defence. By 1915, the once mighty Verdun defences had been hollowed out. More than 237 artillery pieces and over 647 tons of ammunition had been stripped from the forts of the region, leaving only the heaviest turret-mounted guns. French commanders had begun transforming Verdun into a conventional trench-based defence, but progress was slow as resources were diverted westward for the Second Battle of Champagne in the autumn of 1915. By early 1916, General Noël de Castelnau, Chief of Staff at French General Headquarters, inspected the defences. While he reported that most of the work had been satisfactory, he also identified weaknesses in 3 key areas, but by then it was too late. The fortress garrisons had been reduced to mere maintenance crews. Some forts were even prepared for demolition, and in a telling sign of the disconnect between the high command and local officers, when Major General Paul Chrétien, commander of 30 Corps, attempted to inspect Fort Douaumont, he was denied entry by bureaucrats in Paris. Douaumont was the largest fort in the Verdun sector, yet by February 1916, it had been stripped of almost all its firepower. The once formidable structure was left with only a handful of turret-mounted 75mm and 155mm guns, while 68 technicians, under the command of a warrant officer, occupied the vast underground barracks. One of the 6-inch turret guns remained partially manned, but the other had been abandoned entirely. Hotchkiss machine guns were left in storage boxes, and 4 75mm casemate guns had already been removed. The drawbridge had been damaged by German artillery fire and never repaired, while over 11,000 pounds of explosives had been placed inside, primed to demolish the fort should the need arise. One officer recognised the looming catastrophe. Colonel Émile Driant, stationed at Verdun, was deeply concerned. He had warned French Commander-in-Chief Joseph Joffre that stripping Verdun's defences would leave it vulnerable, but Joffre dismissed his concerns. Driant found support in Minister of War Joseph Gallieni, yet it was not enough. Verdun, once considered an impenetrable stronghold, was now little more than an empty shell, and as the Germans prepared to strike, Driant's warnings would soon prove prophetic. By late January 1916, French intelligence accurately assessed the German military build-up at Verdun, but Joffre remained sceptical. He dismissed the reports, believing that any German attack on Verdun would be a diversion rather than the main effort. However, under political pressure, Joffre reluctantly ordered 7th Corps to reinforce Verdun on January 23rd, positioning it on the west bank of the Meuse. Meanwhile, 30 Corps held the eastern flank, and 2nd Corps was tasked with defending the Meuse heights. By the time the German attack was imminent, Verdun's defences had been hastily reinforced. General Frederick Georges Eyre, commander of the right bank, commanded over 8.5 divisions, with 2.5 in close reserve. The French Central Army Group held additional reserves, with 4 divisions nearby, and Joffre maintaining a strategic reserve of 25 divisions. Despite these reinforcements, the French artillery was vastly outgunned. 388 field guns and 244 heavy guns stood against 1,201 German guns, including 14-inch and 16-inch super-heavy mortars specifically designed to shatter fortifications. By February 25th, the German onslaught had already breached French defences. When Castelnau arrived to meet with General de Langle de Carry, who commanded the French Central Army Group, he found that de Carry had doubts about holding the east bank of the Meuse. Castelnau strongly disagreed, and in a decisive moment, he ordered General Hare to hold Verdun at all costs. Hare quickly transferred a division from the west bank and ordered 30 corps to hold a new defensive line running from Brasse to Douaumont, Vaux and Aix. But before reinforcements could arrive, the Germans had already seized the crown jewel of Verdun's defences, Fort Douaumont. That same night, General Philippe Pétain arrived to take command of the defence of Verdun. He immediately ordered all remaining forts to be re-garrisoned and mobilised a desperate effort to stabilise the front. Under Pétain's leadership, the French organised 4 defensive groups under generals Guillaumat, Balfourier, Duchesne and de Basler. A new defensive line was hastily drawn along key fortifications, including Souville, Thiaumont, Fort Vaux, and the ridges of the Woëvre. The West Bank defences were reinforced along Cumières, Mort-Homme and Côte 304. In secret, a last-ditch fallback line was also prepared north of Verdun, running through Forts Belleville, Saint-Michel and Moulainville, a final attempt to keep Verdun from falling. Between February 24th and February 26th, the 1st Corps and 20th Corps arrived, bringing the total number of French divisions at Verdun to 14.5. By March 6th, reinforcements continued to pour in, with the arrival of the 13th, 21st, 14th and 33rd Corps, pushing the total number of French divisions at Verdun to 20.5. At 7:15 a.m. on February 21st, 1916, the German Fifth Army launched Operation Judgment, a storm of artillery fire unlike anything the Western Front had seen. 808 guns pounded the Verdun sector, firing 1 million shells along a front 19 miles long and 3 miles wide. The heaviest 17-inch guns targeted fortresses and the city itself, their relentless barrage sending shockwaves that could be heard from over 99 miles away. At midday, the German artillery paused, a deliberate ploy to draw French defenders out of their positions. As expected, surviving French troops attempted to regroup, revealing their locations to German observation aircraft flying unopposed over the battlefield. That afternoon, at 4 p.m, 3 German Army Corps advanced, using stormtrooper tactics perfected by Captain Willy Rohr and Sturm Battalion 5. The attack combined flamethrowers and hand grenades, overwhelming French positions before defenders could react. German casualties were minimal, while entire French units were wiped out. By February 22nd, German troops had pushed 3 miles forward, capturing the Bois des Cours at the edge of Flabus. Colonel Émile Driant, who had warned of Verdun's vulnerability, fought desperately alongside his 56th and 59th Chasseurs battalions, holding out for 2 days before being killed in action. Of his 1,200 men, only 118 escaped. French commanders were slow to react, unaware of how grave the situation had become. The Germans pushed into Haumont, but at Bois de l'Herbois, French forces fought back, repelling the attack. On February 23rd, the French attempted a counterattack at Bois des Cours, but it failed. By the following day, the French second line of defence collapsed, forcing them into a desperate retreat. In a final attempt to stabilise the front, General Maurice Balfourier's 20th Corps was rushed into battle. That evening, General Castelnau, realising the scale of the disaster, advised General Joffre that the French Second Army under General Philippe Pétain should immediately be sent to Verdun. By February 25th, German forces had captured Beaumont-en-Verdunois, Bois des Fosses and Bois des Courrières. Now, they pushed into Ravin-Hassoul, a key approach leading directly to Fort Douaumont, the strongest fort in Verdun's defences. At 3 p.m, the Brandenburg Regiment 24 launched its assault. The 2nd and 3rd Battalions advanced side by side, moving in 2 waves. But due to a delay in orders, the 3rd Battalion surged ahead without flank support, exposing them to deadly French fire from Douaumont village. Despite the confusion, German troops pushed forward, rushing French positions in the woods and along Côte 347. Machine guns raked the battlefield from Bois Hermitage, but the Germans overran French trenches, forcing defenders to withdraw into Douaumont village. Within 20 minutes, the Germans had achieved their objectives, capturing dozens of French soldiers as they retreated in disarray. A group of 100 German troops pushed ahead toward Fort Douaumont, attempting to signal their artillery with flares, but snow and twilight obscured their position. As they cut through barbed wire, confusion set in. The French mistook them for their own Zouave units retreating. The Germans reached the northeastern end of the fort, encountering no resistance. As they entered through an unguarded bunker, the silence inside was eerie. The vast underground corridors of Douaumont, once a mighty fortress, were almost empty. The German raiding party soon stumbled upon Warrant Officer Chenot and 25 stunned French troops. The entire skeleton crew tasked with maintaining the fort. They surrendered without a fight. By February 26th, the Germans had advanced nearly 2 miles along a 6-mile front. But the cost of the battle was already staggering. 24,000 French troops had fallen, and the Germans had suffered 25,000 casualties of their own. French forces launched an immediate counterattack to retake Douaumont, but it failed spectacularly. Recognizing the dire situation, General Pétain ordered a halt to reckless counterattacks. Instead, he commanded that remaining French positions be reinforced, forts be re-garrisoned and resupplied, and Verdun's defences be prepared for a prolonged siege. By February 27th, the German offensive had begun to slow. A sudden thaw turned the battlefield into a swamp, making it nearly impossible to move artillery forward. French reinforcements were arriving, and their defensive fire became far more effective. Some German artillery pieces broke down, others were stuck in the mud, and the German infantry suffered heavily, with over 500 casualties in the fighting around Douaumont village alone. 2 days later, on February 29th, the German advance stalled completely. A heavy snowfall combined with fierce resistance from the French 33rd Infantry Regiment kept them from pushing forward. Meanwhile, French reinforcements were pouring in. 90,000 men and 23,000 short tons of ammunition arrived from Bar-le-Duc, racing to stabilise the front. The swift German advance had outpaced their own artillery, leaving the infantry without the covering fire they had relied on. Worse, as they pushed south, they came into range of French artillery west of the Meuse, suffering even more losses. The battle had entered a brutal war of attrition. From the beginning, Erich von Falkenhayn had believed that French artillery west of the Meuse could be neutralised by counter-battery fire. This had failed completely. The French guns on the left bank continued hammering German positions, and now the Fifth Army was bleeding heavily. In late February, German generals begged Falkenhayn for reinforcements, but he refused, believing that Verdun had already accomplished its goal of forcing the French to commit their reserves. Yet by February 29th, he began to waver. With the advance slowing to a crawl, he reluctantly released 2 more divisions, but only on the condition that the Germans capture the heights on the West Bank first. A new 2-corps attack force was assembled, commanded by General Heinrich von Goslar. Their objective: to seize Mort Homme and Côte 304, eliminate French artillery west of the Meuse, and complete the East Bank offensive. The Germans concentrated 25 heavy artillery batteries to support the attack, and their artillery command was centralised to ensure better coordination. On March 6th, German forces launched their first attack. The top of Côte 304 was reduced by 17 feet from relentless bombardment. Mort Homme, a ridge filled with hidden French batteries, continued to inflict devastating fire on German forces trying to advance on the east bank. The Germans launched their assault in 2 waves, first striking Bois de Corbeau, capturing it at great cost, only to lose it again to a French counterattack. Then, on March 9th, another major assault was launched from Betancourt, northwest of Mort Homme. After fierce fighting, the Germans retook Bois de Corbeau and pushed into parts of Mort Homme, Côte 304, Cumières and Chatoncourt. After a week of brutal fighting, the Germans had finally reached their first day objectives, but they now realised something devastating. The French guns on Côte de Mar and Bois Bourru were still operational and still cutting down German infantry in horrifying numbers. German artillery was shifted to Côte 265, but this only made them an easier target for French counter-battery fire. By March 14th, the Germans captured Côte 265, the western end of Mort Homme, but they still failed to dislodge the French from Côte 295, the eastern peak. Then on March 20th, after a bombardment of 13,000 mortar shells, the 11th Bavarian and 11th Reserve Divisions attacked Bois d'Avocourt and Bois de Malancourt. The initial assault succeeded, but German commanders hesitated. Instead of pressing forward, they paused to consolidate their gains, giving the French time to reinforce and counterattack. On March 22nd, 2 more German divisions attacked Termite Hill near Côte 304, but were met with overwhelming French artillery fire. The French had begun to perfect their counter-bombardment tactics, hitting German assembly areas and supply lines before they could even launch their attacks. By March 30th, the Germans had captured Bois de Malancourt, but at a staggering cost of 20,000 casualties. The key heights, Côte 304 and Mort Homme, remained in French hands. Desperate for reinforcements, the Germans brought in the 22nd Reserve Corps, and General Max von Gallwitz took command of a new attack force, Angriffsgruppe West. The Germans captured Malancourt on March 31st, Eaucourt on April 5th, and Betancourt on April 8th, but these gains came at an enormous price. On the east bank, German forces pushed toward Fort Vaux, reaching Bois-Cayette and the Vaux-Fleury Railway, only to be repelled by a counterattack from the French 5th Division. On April 9th, 5 German divisions launched a full-scale assault on both banks of the Meuse. They were stopped cold everywhere except Mort Homme, where they managed to push back the French 42nd Division. On the right bank, an attack on Côte de Poivre failed entirely. By now, the German offensive had lost its advantage of surprise. French forces were well supplied, heavily reinforced, and in superior defensive positions. Massed artillery fire still allowed the Germans to make small advances, but French counter-bombardments were just as effective, keeping German troops isolated and vulnerable. The battle had reached a deadly stalemate. Each time the Germans seized a critical position, they discovered that it was overlooked by another height, which had to be captured next. But each attack cost thousands of lives, and as March dragged on, German commanders realized the horrific truth. The battle had no logical endpoint. The only way to stop was to either withdraw or push forward at an unbearable cost. By March 31st, German losses had reached 81,607 casualties. Falkenhayn began to doubt the entire strategy. The battle was looking more and more like another First Battle of Ypres, a drawn-out, bloody struggle that achieved nothing. Yet, Despite these growing doubts, the Fifth Army insisted on continuing. On April 4th, they requested even more reinforcements, arguing that the French were on the verge of collapse. But Falkenhayn was no longer convinced. He warned his commanders that the French still had plenty of reserves and that Germany's own resources were reaching their limit. If the next German push failed to take the Meuse Heights, then he would be forced to accept that Verdun had been a failure. By mid-April, the German offensive had slowed, but the Fifth Army commanders still wanted to push forward. The German infantry remained exposed to relentless artillery fire, suffering constant losses as they moved across terrain obliterated by their own bombardments. Communications to the rear were vulnerable, and trenches were nearly impossible to construct in the churned-up wasteland. Morale was beginning to break. German soldiers endured ceaseless French artillery and poison gas attacks, and commanders feared that halting the offensive would be even worse than continuing. If they did not advance, they would have to fall back all the way to their original positions in February, an outcome they considered unacceptable. But as the battle continued, Falkenhayn's original plan was abandoned. Instead of forcing the French to bleed themselves dry in counterattacks, the Germans were now the ones wasting thousands of lives in full-scale assaults against dug-in French positions. By the end of April, Falkenhayn had committed 21 divisions to Verdun, most of the strategic reserve, and had even begun pulling troops from the Eastern Front. The grinding, attritional battle had consumed both sides, and yet the Germans had barely advanced. From April 20th, Falkenhayn ordered new attack tactics. Instead of launching wide-front assaults, he wanted small elite stormtrooper units, Stoßtruppen, to strike first, armed with automatic weapons, hand grenades, flamethrowers, and mortars. These teams would bypass strongpoints, allowing the main infantry force to move in later. Artillery was reorganised, with field and heavy guns placed under a single command to allow for converging fire from different locations. German infantry was ordered to stay as close as possible to the barrage line, moving immediately after the shelling to take full advantage of the confusion among French defenders. But Knobelsdorff, the Fifth Army's Chief of Staff, refused to change course. He believed speed and momentum were more important than infantry conservation, and so he pushed for larger, full-scale assaults, contrary to Falkenhayn's revised orders. Commanders who disagreed with him were removed. By early May, the Germans had shifted to limited attacks, responding to French counterattacks on April 11th and 17th. They also targeted key positions west of the Meuse, hoping to weaken French defences before renewing a major push. On May 4th, German forces captured the north slope of Côte 304, and by May 7th, they had pushed the French off the crest. However, the intensity of French artillery fire made it impossible for German forces to hold the ridge. On May 24th, the Germans captured Cumières and Corretz, while the French prepared a counterattack on Fort Douaumont. With the Germans gaining ground, General Nivelle, now in command of the Second Army, ordered a counterattack on Fort Douaumont. The original plan had called for a massive, multi-division assault, but German advances on Fausse Côte and Couleuvre Ravine forced the French to scale down their plans. The French High Command refused to commit more troops, as they were being reserved for the upcoming Somme offensive. As a result, the attack would be carried out by a single division, with one in reserve. General Charles Mangin, who would later be known as the Butcher, was given the task. His attack force would assault Douaumont on a 1,200-yard front, aiming to recapture trenches, machine gun turrets, and the fort itself. However, French troops captured on May 13th revealed the entire plan to the Germans, who responded by intensifying their artillery bombardments, slowing French preparations. On May 17th, the French bombardment began, with 4 massive 370mm mortars and 300 heavy guns. Over the next few days, the German garrison inside the fort suffered terrible conditions. The walls buckled under the impact of shells, and the air became filled with concrete dust, smoke, and the stench of corpses. By May 20th, supplies were running low, and communications with the rear had been cut off. Outside the fort, conditions for the German infantry were even worse. The French artillery barrage had obliterated trenches, leaving troops huddled in shell craters without food or water. By May 22nd, the German frontline units had been reduced to just 37 men near Thielmont Farm. The French attack began at 11:50 am on May 22nd. On the left flank, French 36th Infantry Regiment quickly captured Monchetranche and Bonnet-d'Evêque, but took heavy losses. On the right flank, a battalion of the 74th Infantry Regiment was pinned down, while another managed to reach a machine gun turret east of the fort, but found itself cut off from support. In the centre, the 129th Infantry Regiment reached Fort Douaumont within minutes and forced its way inside. By nightfall, half of the fort had been retaken. French commanders rushed to reinforce their troops inside the fort, sending in the 34th Division. However, German reserves counterattacked, cutting off the French forces inside Douaumont and forcing them to surrender. Over 1,000 French prisoners were taken, and within 3 days the French had lost 5,640 men out of the 12,000 sent into battle. The Germans suffered 4,500 casualties, but managed to hold the fort. The assault on Fort Douaumont had failed, and the Germans still held their ground. But the cost was horrific. Both sides were losing men at an unsustainable rate. And while the Germans had defended Douaumont, the broader battle still raged on. By late May, the German focus shifted once again, from the left bank of the Meuse to the right bank, south of Fort Douaumont. The goal was clear: to break through to Fleury Ridge, the last significant French defensive line. The Germans aimed to capture key positions, including Ouvrage de Thiaumont, Fleury, Fort Souville, and Fort Vaux, which had endured relentless artillery bombardment since the beginning of the offensive. The attack intensified on June 1st, with 10,000 German troops storming Fort Vaux. The fortress was partially overrun by June 2nd, but fierce fighting continued underground as the French defenders held on. For 5 more days, the French garrison, cut off from reinforcements and running out of water, fought desperately in the fortress tunnels. Finally, on June 7th, the 574 surviving French soldiers surrendered. When news of Fort Vaux's loss reached Verdun, panic set in. A final defensive line was occupied, and trenches were dug on the very edge of the city itself. On the left bank, the Germans had advanced from Côte 304, Mort-Homme, and Cumières, threatening to cut off the French positions at Chatoncourt and Avocourt. But the advance slowed significantly. Heavy rains turned the battlefield into a swamp of mud and corpses, and the French launched counterattacks, keeping the Germans from breaking through. By June 22nd, the German High Command knew they had to break the stalemate. That morning, they unleashed over 116,000 shells filled with diphosgene gas, a chemical weapon known as Green Cross, against French artillery positions. The attack caused over 1,600 casualties, silencing many of the French guns. With the French artillery weakened, German infantry attacked on June 23rd, pushing forward on a 3-mile front. The assault was devastatingly effective. French positions were shattered, and the Germans advanced nearly 2 miles into enemy territory. They captured Ouvrage de Thiaumont, Fleury, and Chapelle Sainte-Fine, coming dangerously close to Fort Souville. the German front lines were now just over 3 miles from the Verdun citadel, closer than ever before. But the French were not broken. In the chaos of battle, French counterattacks recaptured Chapelle Sainte-Fine. The German advance stalled as the supply of water and ammunition to the front lines collapsed. The newly won German salient was now exposed to French artillery fire from 3 sides, making any further progress impossible. By June 25th, both armies were exhausted, and the Germans called off the attack. By July 1st, the tide was finally beginning to turn. In the previous month alone, the French had suffered 185,000 casualties, while the German losses had climbed to over 200,000. Meanwhile, the Brusilov offensive had begun on the Eastern Front, forcing Germany to divert resources away from Verdun. And on July 1st, the Battle of the Somme began, a massive British and French assault that further drained German manpower and artillery. The Verdun front was no longer a priority, but fighting continued. On July 9th, the Germans launched a massive attack on Fort Souville, bombarding the area with over 300,000 shells. Despite this overwhelming firepower, French artillery and machine gun fire cut down the German assault troops, preventing them from advancing. A handful of German soldiers from Infantry Regiment 140 reached the top of Fort Souville on July the 12th, from where they could see the rooftops of Verdun. But the attack collapsed. French counterattacks pushed them back, and by July 15th, the Germans were ordered onto the defensive. Throughout August and September, the French launched wave after wave of counterattacks. On August 18th, Fleury was recaptured, and by September, much of the ground lost over the previous 2 months had been regained. German High Command saw no further gains to be made at Verdun, and on August 29th, Erich von Falkenhayn was dismissed as Chief of the General Staff, replaced by Paul von Hindenburg and Erich Ludendorff. With new leadership, the Germans focused entirely on defence, but the French were not finished. By October 20th, the French were ready to launch a decisive counteroffensive, their first objective to retake Fort Douaumont. After weeks of careful preparation, the attack began on October 24th. French artillery had been reorganised, and in the 6-day preliminary bombardment, they fired over 855,000 shells. Over 700 guns blasted the German positions. The most powerful of them all, 2 Saint-Chamond railway guns, positioned 13 miles to the southwest, fired 400mm shells weighing nearly a ton each, striking Fort Douaumont directly. The French assault began at 11:40 a.m. Advancing behind a devastating creeping barrage, French Marines and colonial infantry surged forward, overwhelming the German defenders. The battle inside the fort was brief. The Germans, already weakened by the French bombardment, were quickly overwhelmed. By October 25th, Fort Douaumont had been fully retaken, along with over 6,000 German prisoners and 15 artillery pieces. Fort Vaux was next. For a full week, French artillery pounded the fortress, and on November 2nd, the Germans evacuated the fort, fearing another assault. The French reoccupied Fort Vaux unopposed. By November 5th, the French had pushed forward to the very front lines of February 24th, right where the battle had begun. For the first time in 10 months, the battlefield looked the same as it had before the first German attack. The Battle of Verdun was not over, but the momentum had shifted. For the first time in nearly a year, the French were in control. By mid-December, the French were ready for their final offensive at Verdun. This would be the second offensive Battle of Verdun, a coordinated assault devised by General Philippe Pétain and General Robert Nivelle, and led by General Charles Mangin. The French plan was meticulous. 4 divisions, the 126th, 38th, 37th, and 133rd would spearhead the attack, with 4 more in reserve. 740 heavy artillery guns had been gathered to pulverise the German defences. The bombardment began 6 days earlier, and by the time the assault was set to begin, the French guns had fired over 1,169,000 shells. The final artillery barrage was directed from aircraft, targeting trenches, dugouts, and observation posts. The Germans had 5 divisions defending the sector, but many of their units were severely under strength. 2 divisions had fewer than 3,000 infantry each, less than half their usual numbers. At 10 a.m. on December 15th, the French attack began. It was preceded by a carefully timed creeping barrage. 2 layers of shrapnel and high explosive shells moving in perfect synchronization with the advancing infantry. The German defences collapsed almost immediately. Trapped in their bunkers, 13,500 German soldiers, nearly 2/3 of the frontline defenders, were captured almost without a fight. The French recaptured Louvemont, Vacherville, Hardemont, and Côte du Poivre, all towns lost in the opening weeks of the battle nearly 10 months earlier. The German reserves were slow to respond. Battalions sent forward did not reach the front until nightfall, and 2 divisions ordered to reinforce the line the day before were still nearly 14 miles away by noon. By the night of December 16th, the French had consolidated their new front line. They had pushed the Germans back nearly 5 miles, regained all the dominating high ground, and inflicted massive losses. Over 11,300 German troops were taken prisoner, and 115 artillery guns were captured. The success of the French counteroffensive was so complete that even German officers taken prisoner complained about their conditions in captivity. General Mangin mockingly responded, "We do regret it, gentlemen, but then, we did not expect so many of you." On December 16th, General Max von Lochow, commander of the 5th Army, and General Hans von Zweil, commander of the 14th Reserve Corps, were both dismissed. By late December of 1916, the Battle of Verdun was over, but its consequences would shape the remainder of the war. At its core, Verdun had been a battle of attrition, a brutal test of endurance. General Erich von Falkenhayn, the German chief of the General Staff, had devised a strategy he believed would bleed France dry. In a memorandum written after the war, he claimed to have told Kaiser Wilhelm II in December of 1915 that Verdun was an objective the French could not afford to lose. If the Germans could force the French to commit their reserves, they could be ground down by relentless artillery fire. This strategy was rooted in the lessons of the Eastern Front, where Germany and Austria-Hungary had inflicted massive losses on Russia between 1914 and 1915. But France was not Russia. Instead of collapsing, the French army adapted, rotating entire divisions in and out of the battle in a system known as the Noria, ensuring that no single unit was completely shattered. The symbolism of Verdun became just as important as the battlefield itself, reinforcing the French will to fight rather than breaking it. Throughout 1916, Falkenhayn had to repeatedly justify his strategy, insisting that the French were on the verge of collapse. By March, German military intelligence had estimated that France had already lost 100,000 men, and Falkenhayn was convinced the French army could not sustain another 100,000 casualties. In May, he believed that French losses had risen to over 500,000, while Germany had suffered only half that number. The reality was different. By the start of May, French losses were closer to 130,000, while Germany had lost 100,000. As the battle continued into the summer, it became clear that Germany had underestimated the resilience of the French army. By the end of April, the Germans had been forced to commit almost all of their strategic reserve to Verdun, suffering similar casualties to the French. The belief that Germany could inflict 5 French casualties for every 2 Germans was proving to be a dangerous miscalculation. In June, France had over 2,700 artillery guns at Verdun, including more than 1,100 field guns. From February to December, the two sides fired a combined 10 million artillery shells, weighing nearly 1.4 million tons. The Verdun battlefield had been transformed into a wasteland, where entire forests had been obliterated and villages had vanished under the weight of constant bombardment. By midsummer, the strategic situation had shifted against Germany. The Brusilov offensive, launched by Russia on June 4th, inflicted massive losses on Austria-Hungary, forcing Germany to divert troops from the Western Front. Then on July 1st, the Anglo-French offensive on the Somme began, drawing even more German resources away from Verdun. This was the first real strategic success of the French plan. Verdun had forced Germany to exhaust itself in a grinding battle, and when the moment came, Germany found itself overstretched. At Verdun, the German Fifth Army had lost 26,000 men in the first 10 days. By comparison, the German Second Army suffered 40,000 casualties in the first 10 days of the Battle of the Somme. Despite the horrific British losses on the first day of the battle, the Somme offensive forced Germany onto the defensive across the Western Front. By August, Falkenhayn was losing control. On August 29th, he was dismissed and replaced by Paul von Hindenburg and Erich Ludendorff. The new German command ended the offensive at Verdun on September 2nd, effectively abandoning the strategy that had defined the battle. Falkenhayn had believed that Germany could destroy the French army in a single campaign, but instead, Verdun became a catastrophic experience for both sides. The French had not collapsed, the British had not been defeated on the Somme, and Germany had suffered enormous losses without achieving a decisive breakthrough. Verdun had been intended as the death blow to France, but by the end of 1916, it had become a war Germany could no longer afford to win. By the time the Battle of Verdun ended in December of 1916, it had become one of the longest and bloodiest battles in human history. The sheer scale of destruction, both in terms of human lives and the landscape itself, was almost unimaginable. Yet, determining the exact number of casualties has remained a challenge for historians. The way casualties were recorded varied between the French and German armies. The French military compiled reports every 5 days, tracking those killed, wounded, or missing in action. However, the data was fragmented, spread across different military departments, hospitals, and war offices. The Germans, meanwhile, maintained loss lists every 10 days, which were later revised after the war to include previously missing medical data. These differences in record keeping have led to discrepancies in casualty estimates. Most historians agree that French losses ranged between 377,000 and 378,000, while German casualties were between 337,000 and 362,000. This meant that, over the course of 10 months, an average of 70,000 men were killed, wounded, or captured each month. Some historians, including Winston Churchill, believed that French losses exceeded German losses by a ratio of 3 to 2, though later research suggests that both sides suffered at nearly the same rate. For those who fought at Verdun, it was not just a battle, it was hell on earth. The fighting took place in a devastated landscape where shell craters, shattered forests, and bodies of the fallen stretched in every direction. Heavy rains turned the battlefield into a quagmire of mud and corpses, with shell craters filling with water, drowning wounded soldiers who fell inside. The constant barrage of artillery fire left many men broken, not just physically, but mentally, as they endured the relentless horror of war. The impact on French morale was profound. Some French soldiers attempted to desert, fleeing toward Spain, but if captured, they faced court-martial and execution. One such case occurred on March 20th, when a group of French deserters revealed key defensive positions to the Germans, leading to the encirclement and surrender of 2,000 men. A French lieutenant, struggling to find the words to describe what he had witnessed, wrote in his diary, "Humanity is mad. It must be mad to do what it is doing. What a massacre! What scenes of horror and carnage! I cannot find words to translate my impressions. Hell cannot be so terrible. Men are mad." By June of 1916, the toll of the battle began to manifest in the discipline of the French army. When General Pétain was promoted and replaced by General Nivelle, 5 French infantry regiments displayed open discontent, with soldiers questioning whether Verdun was worth the sacrifice. 2 French lieutenants, Henri Herdouin and Pierre Milon, were summarily executed on June 11th for failing to hold their positions. Their deaths would later become a cause célèbre, and in 1926, an official inquiry exonerated them, removing their conviction from the record. As the war continued into 1917, the French army was determined to reclaim the high ground around Verdun, the very same positions that had cost so many lives the year before. In August of 1917, they launched a new offensive, striking at German positions on both sides of the Meuse River. The plan was ambitious, a 5-mile-wide advance aimed at retaking key hills and defensive positions. To prepare, the French military rebuilt over 20 miles of roads and reinforced supply lines, ensuring that ammunition and troops could be moved efficiently. They gathered an overwhelming force of artillery, more than 1,500 heavy guns, along with a fleet of reconnaissance planes and fighter squadrons to dominate the skies. The Germans, however, were well prepared. They had spent over a year reinforcing their defences at Verdun, digging tunnels beneath Mort-Homme and fortifying key observation points. Their 380 artillery batteries fired the deadly new mustard gas, and German forces launched several spoiling attacks, attempting to disrupt French preparations before they could even begin. Despite these obstacles, the French attack began on August 20th. After days of brutal fighting, they recaptured most of their objectives. The heavily fortified Hill 304 held out for a few days longer, but finally fell on August 24th. In total, the French took 11,000 German prisoners, but suffered 14,000 casualties of their own. As the battle continued into September, the Germans launched counterattacks, attempting to retake the ground they had lost. The French stood firm, reinforcing their positions with trenches and fortifications. But the fighting was far from over. On November 25th, after a 5-hour artillery bombardment, the French launched another raid, demolishing a network of German pillboxes before withdrawing to their lines. But Verdun was not the final chapter of the war. In 1918, as the Allies prepared their final offensive, American and French forces joined together to launch an attack from Moronvilliers to the Meuse River. On September 26th, the Meuse-Argonne offensive began. The American First Army, advancing alongside the French Fourth Army, quickly captured key villages and outflanked German positions. Over the next several weeks, they pushed forward, taking Montfaucon Ridge, Brabant, Aumont, and Bois de Cour, crossing the very front line that had been so bitterly fought over in 1916. By the time the armistice was signed on November 11th, 1918, the Germans had suffered heavy losses, and their retreat had turned into a collapse. Over the course of the Meuse-Argonne offensive, more than 20,000 German soldiers were taken prisoner, along with over 150 artillery pieces and thousands of machine guns. Verdun, once again, had proven to be the graveyard of German ambitions. But Verdun was more than just a battlefield. It was a symbol, a place where the limits of human endurance had been tested in fire and blood. To the French, Verdun became the defining memory of the Great War, much like the Somme for the British and Canadians. As one historian put it, like Auschwitz, Verdun marks a transgression of the limits of the human condition. The scars of the battle remain. Entire villages were wiped from the earth, their ruins left untouched as ghost towns, reminders of the war's devastation. The landscape itself was permanently altered, with forests planted to cover what had become a vast unmarked graveyard containing the remains of over 100,000 missing soldiers. Many of them were eventually laid to rest in the Douaumont ossuary, a sombre monument to those who had died in the fields and trenches of Verdun. But Verdun also became a place of reconciliation. In the decades that followed, France and Germany sought to heal the wounds of war. In 1964, Verdun was officially recognised as a capital of peace, dedicated to preserving the memory of those who had suffered and died. And in one of the most powerful moments of modern history, on September 22nd, 1984, French President François Mitterrand and German Chancellor Helmut Kohl stood together at the Douaumont Cemetery, side by side, hand in hand, in the pouring rain. One had fought in the war, the other had been a prisoner of it, yet both understood that Verdun was more than just a battlefield. It was a lesson about war, a lesson about suffering, and a lesson about the importance of peace. The Battle of Verdun had lasted for 302 days, claimed hundreds of thousands of lives, and left a permanent scar on the world's memory. But in the end, Verdun was not just the longest battle of the war, it was its most unforgettable. Thank you for listening to this journey through one of the most harrowing battles in history. If you enjoyed this and want to hear more, please consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel. It really helps bring these stories to more people. And as always, sleep well, my friends.